Good evening, folks. Wonderful to see everyone here and such a great turnout. Beautiful day. I'm glad that you could all join us. Before I begin, let me just point out our emergency exits. Through the back here, you'll have access to one set of stairs. If you exit here, you have the main stairs that you can come up, that many of you may have come up. And then to the back left, to the right of the elevators, there's a third set of staircase. So just look for me or any of my staff members. Raise your hand in the back so people can see who it is. And Caleb up front here. Just follow them on out, just in case anything happens. But wonderful to have you all here again. Let me just offer you some background on our terrorism program here at CSIS, known as the Transnational Threats Project. We have been in business since the very early 90s when it started out as the Global Organized Crime Project under Arno Dvorgrov, and Alexander Dvorgrov is here. We're very happy to have you, Alexander, and to have you as a member of our senior steering committee. So thank you for all that you do. What we do here is, and you may have seen the details on the screen beforehand, is we conduct research in the field. We conduct research here. We have a team of 7 people. We have senior advisors. A few of them are here today. Thank you very much. And we get into the field to look at the degree and nature of the terror threat. We look at the conditions that foster and enable and sustain the threat. We look at the nature of the threat itself, its ideology, its financing, its structure, and its operations. And then we look at the response to that. We bring that back and we brief it out to a range of audiences. Governments, the US and friendly governments. We also brief the private sector, media, general public, academia, and many others. And what we hope to do with this is improve perspectives and understanding on terrorism so that when counterterrorism policy is made, when we meet with counterterrorism practitioners, when we meet with warfighters, when we meet with the media, and a lot of other folks, that there's better understanding and better information as folks move forward in countering what we have today, which is a tremendous threat. How do we do that? In the field, we interview a full spectrum of individuals, from terrorists, insurgents, and traffickers, and other organized crime figures, to clergy, to refugees, to internally displaced persons, to journalists, foreign service officers, host nation security services, a lot of individuals that we can gain perspective from, and it is quite valuable, and also folks who are in the private sector provide very, very valuable perspectives. And as General Hayden can attest, having led the CIA, private sector expertise also makes quite an impact. Recent field work, and again, that is our main thrust, is to get into the field, includes Nigeria and Niger. Just a few weeks ago, went up to Maiduguri in the northeast to look at Boko Haram, to Mali, into the northeast, to Gao, to Senegal, to Tunisia, and to the Turkey and Syria border, where I interviewed an ISIS fighter, 16 years old, a Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda's group inside of Syria, their primary social media activist, and then a range of other officials and individuals that provided a lot of understanding, a lot of feedback on what's happening with the battle against ISIS and many others. But tonight we have a tremendous and unique opportunity to hear about these threats and more from a gentleman who's been at the forefront of bringing greater insights to all of us and all the audiences listed above, but most importantly, directly to the President of the United States. Our guest is retired U.S. Air Force General Michael Hayden. As director of the CIA, General Hayden was responsible for overseeing the collection of information concerning the plans, intentions, and capabilities of America's adversaries, producing timely analysis for decision makers, and conducting covert operations to thwart terrorists and other enemies of the United States. General Hayden is now at the Chertoff Group, where he uses his broad geographic and political knowledge to brief clients on intelligence matters worldwide, including cyber security that may affect their businesses. To quote General Hayden, "The best defense is knowing what your enemies are up to before they know you know it." And for today's CEOs, there's also the challenge of figuring out who and where your enemies are. Before becoming director of the CIA, General Hayden served as the country's first principal deputy director of national intelligence and was the highest-ranking intelligence officer in the armed forces. Earlier, he served as commander of the Air Intelligence Agency, director of the Joint Command and Control Warfare Center, director of the National Security Agency, and chief of the Central Security Service. Those are some pretty heady responsibilities. General Hayden graduated from Duquesne University with a bachelor's degree in history in 1967, also a tumultuous time, and a master's degree in modern American history in 1969. He also did postgraduate work at the Defense Intelligence School, conducted by the Defense Intelligence Agency, and we have a former director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, Ed Soyser. General Soyser, thank you for joining us. General Hayden, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Let me begin I'll ask you a couple of primary questions about the experience of writing the book and the value of the book. Incidentally, as you see it right here, and many of you purchased the book, and thank you for signing those books. Playing to the Edge, American Intelligence in the Age of Terror. So let me start off and remind folks that there will be a question and answer session at the end for about 20, 25 minutes. And those of you watching online, thank you for doing so. You can send us questions via the TNT Twitter account at CSIS_threats using the hashtag CSIS Live. So let's start off first by talking about why you wrote the book and what the value is for government, for the private sector, for media, academia, and the general public.
So the why. Let me call your attention to something near the end and then something at the very beginning. At the end, I talk about teaching across the river at George Mason. And I have a course in intelligence and policy. And I actually begin the course every semester at kind of the level of metaphysics. I start with Plato's parable of the cave. You know, the fire, the shadows, the voices, and can we know truth? And we ratchet quickly beyond metaphysics, get something still philosophical, a little more concrete. And I ask the students, is espionage compatible with a democracy? You know, espionage, a process, an enterprise that requires secrecy, democracy, an enterprise that demands transparency. And generally, I get unanimity. I think it has something to do with I'm the former director of CIA, and I'll give them their final grade, all right? And this is the first encounter with me. And they all agree, yeah, espionage is compatible with a democracy. And then I double down. And I actually make the case, and I make the case here, that espionage is not just compatible with, but essential to a democracy. And the premise is frightened people don't make good Democrats or Republicans, small d, small r in both cases. That what it is we do isn't just making America safe, but given human nature and our own history, if we fail, it's just not security that's on the line, it's our liberty. All right? So I make that the essentiality of espionage. That's the back end of the book. For something so essential, and let me start that over again. I don't know of anything so essential, so mis- or ununderstood in broader American political culture. Right? So at the beginning of the book, and I know there are quite a few Australians here, at the beginning of the book, I have myself at Alice Springs, out in the outback. I mean, it is the outermost outback. I mentioned in the book, you get off the plane at the airport, you drive down the road. Okay. and you get to a T, and it's Alice, maybe 15K over this way. Ayers Rock, 750 that way. And that's kind of where you are. And I talk about walking out of the ops floor at Pine Gap, which is a facility we share there. It was a Five Eyes conference, you know, the Anglo-Saxon club. And we were walking out of the ops floor, and I turned to my Australian counterpart and say, wouldn't you like to show your citizens what those kids are doing in there? And of course he goes, yeah. Well, that's kind of the purpose of the book. Given the essentiality but broad misunderstanding of espionage, I want to show our citizens what it is we do in there. Mm-hmm. And so kind of metaphorically, I'm taking our citizens up to the door, punching in the cipher code, opening the door, and inviting them into the very limits of law and policy to meet the people there and to see what it is they do on their behalf. So that's the why.
Wonderful. Excellent. What was it like pulling together a book on so many sensitive topics in an age where there's constantly changing facts on the ground and threats and whatnot? It must have been quite a challenge.
So yeah, but it's a memoir, and so it's mine, all right? And the technique, I bought an iPad, and I brought it with me every time I was going to fly across a continent or an ocean. And I would just say, all right, what is it this trip? And I'd pick one out of the air, Al-Kabar, which is a chapter in the book entitled No Core, No War. It's a nuclear reactor in the eastern Syrian desert. And I just kind of go stream of consciousness on the flight, in the air, on the ground during free time, on the way back. And generally, when I got home on the topic, I'd have 2,500 words, 3,000, and a lot of gaps. And at that point, I would call the agencies and say, I'm going to need to see my stuff from here and there and about this and that. And boy, it would really be nice if I could talk to him and him and him and her and her and him and her. And the agencies would go ahead and arrange that. Now, they would retrieve the documents gratis, all right? But unfortunately, I couldn't talk to anybody, number one, unless they volunteered, all right? And number two, they had to take leave. They couldn't book the time they talked to me on the clock. And I say in the book that I talked to over 70 people, all right? I had 2 people who said no. I'm looking at some people I know who know the agency pretty well. They were the current and former head of the Counterterrorism Center who have said no. And finally they said, we don't talk to anybody. We kind of like you, but we don't talk to anybody. And so they wouldn't talk. Everyone else was quite willing. I took notes from my documents, my files, and from the interviews with a handler. I had somebody from the Publications Review Board there. And then I would have to hand my notes into them. They would send it through the process, turn it around after 3 or 4 long weeks, and then I would bring them home and marry them up to the 2,500 words sitting on the iPad. I worked that for a while. When that's done, I got about 80% of what I really want or need, and then the rest is refining and fine-tuning and some additional research. When I get all done, I then have to submit everything to NSA, CIA, the DNI, and the Department of Defense. And I said that correctly. They all wanted everything. I couldn't say these are the CIA parts, these are the NSA parts. And so it went through what's called publication review. I somewhat self-censored. Obviously, I'm writing on an airplane, so I'm being pretty careful what it is I'm saying. But even after I've gathered the notes, there are some things I know I should not talk about, and I don't try. There are a bunch of things I felt I should talk about, and I pushed pretty hard. Everything I thought I should talk about is in this book. I occasionally had to fuzz things. You can't say 1,400, Hayden. Say more than 1,000. Okay, fine, more than 1,000. Or there's actually a couple of incidents where it was, you're okay saying it, but we don't want you saying it next to this. Move that chunk over here. All right, and so I did. And so I actually, to be quite candid, it wasn't a totally painless process. But everything I wanted to say is in there.
Good, wonderful. It does sound like a painful process, and knowing a few people in the crowd here have written their books and from the intelligence community, I know that Publication Review Board is a tough customer. Let's talk a little bit about some contemporary issues. In the background of this discussion, of course, is the attack on Brussels.
Right.
And in November, the attack in Paris, the attack in Beirut, the attack on the Russian aircraft out of the Sinai. So a lot of activity on the part of ISIS. One of the main themes that emerged from this is that there's not a lot of intelligence sharing. You mentioned Five Eyes. This is the grouping of New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the United States, and Great Britain to share intelligence. And apparently there's not enough sharing across Europe. There's, in fact, often more sharing between Europeans and the United States than within Europe itself.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. So, of course, we do have a lot of the best information to offer, but nonetheless, there needs to be more sharing. What has your reaction been to what are clear failures on the part of organizations that are working incredibly hard, are dealing with clandestine organizations that have great operational and informational security protocols? They're hard targets.
Yep.
So what do we do?
So I mean, kind of the fabric of the book. Now that you've gotten kind of the why, the what in the book is this is actually hard work, and there are very difficult choices, and I kind of man up on the Stellar Wind, which was the NSA surveillance program. I inherited and adjusted but did not end renditions, detentions, interrogations. We actually were advocates for and successful in advocating increased in targeted killings. All right? So these are all very controversial questions and remain controversial even in retrospect. The book's not very apologetic, but it freely admits these are edgy decisions. All right, so now you take that kind of fabric and fast forward the tape to what's happened in Paris and in Brussels. I don't treat that in the book, all right? But in my public commentary of what's been going on, Jim, I kind of liken it to a soccer match, all right? And when Paris happens or Brussels happens, most of the public commentary, most of the energy about how come and what do we need to do now is focused on what I would call our own goalmouth. It's all focused on stuff happening from the 18-yard line in. You know, how come you didn't stop them there? Where's the right security perimeter at the airport? How far should you go out? I mean, it's all pretty defensive. It's all pretty close in, and frankly, it all kind of defaults to a law enforcement model. All right, down in this space here. If I extrapolate what I said in the book to current events, what I would be saying is, yeah, go ahead and do that. But, you know, if you make this penalty kicks, it really doesn't matter how big, strong, fast, or agile your goalie is. That ball's going to the back of the net. And what you really need to do is to control the midfield. Right? And by control of the midfield, in this context, is all those things some Americans and a whole bunch of Europeans have been wringing their hands about for the past 4 or 5 years. And controlling the midfield is that broad, aggressive intelligence enterprise that, well, there's a line in the book, we're in New Zealand, but within a year of 9/11, and Eliza Manningham Buller, who's then deputy head, but then becomes head of MI5, says, you realize, gentlemen, the rest of us were men, you realize, gentlemen, what our problem is. We're all well accustomed to dealing with the guilty. Our task is to deal with the not yet guilty. Okay? And that's what controlling the midfield is. That's that rather aggressive, rather broad intelligence collection enterprise that, again, repeat, was somewhat controversial here, very controversial in Europe. And so the book is kind of an argument for, unless you want this to be penalty kicks, you got to control the midfield. And controlling the midfield entails some of these very hard choices. And then I go one step further in the analogy. And you know, from time to time, since we're controlling the midfield now, why don't we put the ball in their 18? Why don't we get down near their goal mouth and start trying to score goals, which then is the targeted killing program and frankly, aggressive, in this case, American action to take the fight to the enemy and make them as worried about defense rather than fretting about how they conduct offense about us.
Indeed, and so, I think that may induce a question about offensive hacking back.
But you understand the point. Sure. I mean, for heaven's sake, it's called playing to the edge. All right, it's again, it's not apologetic, but it is trying to explain why we were so aggressive. I got to add, all right, this is kind of week 5 of the book tour, and so I was all pumped that I would be spending all my time explaining why we were so aggressive playing to the edge. I got overtaken by this here presidential campaign, and I've spent at least as much time explaining that there are edges.
Yeah, that's great. Fantastic. Let me ask one more question from our perch here at CSIS. You're familiar with our long history of working with policymakers, with other folks in government, with the general public, and the information that we offer. How can groups outside of government help in this effort? Yeah,
I touch a little bit on it near the end, all right? And here I touch upon, in one sense, given the shift in our political culture, people like me are not going to be able to continue to do what people like me think we should be doing unless people like you know more about what it is we're doing. Yeah, that came out right.
Catch that?
Yeah. No, I mean, the political culture has shifted out from underneath us. And it's just not intelligence. It's all aspects of government. A greater demand for transparency, all right? And so we have got to work out a way by which the broader society legitimates what it is we do. I'll be very brief, but the Snowden revelations is kind of the last chapter in the book. My old agency up at Fort Meade thought they were good to go. I mean, for heaven's sakes, the big story, the 215, the metadata story, the phone bills up at the fort, for God's sakes, it's been approved by 2 presidents. Congress knew about it. The committees were all briefed in. The strongest supporters of the whole program were the 2 intel committees. And oh yeah, the court did oversight, all right? The NSA thought, God, we're good, check. I use the line in there, that's the Madisonian trifecta. You know, you got the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch all signed up. And so the natural instinct was, oh no, this is fine. We have your sanction. And what happened is that the political culture shifted underneath. And a lot of Americans, and not just the wingnuts, a lot of Americans, straight-thinking, solid-thinking Americans said, I'm not so sure, big guy, that constitutes consent of the governed anymore. That may be consent of the governors. You may have told them, but you didn't tell me. So the first thing is in the dialogue with the American people, institutions like this have a very important role to play to build a broader national understanding of what it is we do. All right? And I make no bones about it. Going public with some stuff is going to shave points off of effectiveness. But I go back to my original comment. Unless we do that, we're not going to get to do this stuff in the first place. The other major role is that a lot of what it is we do in the intelligence community, up to and including the direct action thing about putting the ball in their goal mouth, all right, is about buying time and space for policymakers to make big decisions and to change realities on the ground. There is a line in the book, when I'm President Obama's CIA chief for 3 weeks, we have a successful operational action. I mention it on the margins of an NSC meeting. I tell the story in the book. Rahm Emanuel comes up and pushes me from behind and says, good on you guys. And I mentioned there that Rahm Emanuel said something nice. I should slowly back out of the room, pocket the compliment, and leave it there. But I only had a couple of days left. And so I actually said to him, Rahm, thanks. I meant it. I really appreciate it. He didn't have to say that, but he did. I said, but Rahm, you got to understand, unless we change the facts on the ground, we get to kill people forever. And so what I'm saying is, although we in intelligence can actually provide some wisdom and actually buy time and space for policymakers to be wise, folks like you have a really important role to play in creating that national wisdom. There's a wonderful Israeli movie called The Gatekeepers. Okay, it's 6 heads of Shin Bet who do the heavy lifting for the Israelis, for the Israeli state, for all of their careers. And there's this deep anxiety expressed by all 6 heads of Shin Bet about what I just said. We did the heavy lifting. We did your bidding. We created time. We created space. And you didn't use it. And so folks like CSIS have a role to play into informing judgments and, frankly, forcing those tougher decisions beyond just the here and now.
Thank you. Fantastic response. So let me open it up to the audience. Please state your name, your affiliation, and make sure it's a question. We have a full house, and we need these to be brief questions. We'll go to John McGaffin, advisor to the Transnational Threats Project, among other things.
Hi, John McGaffin.
Hey, John.
CSIS and other places. I couldn't agree with you more on this business of if we'd been more forward-leaning about explaining to the American public what we do, maybe things would be different. I've wrestled with this for my whole life. I don't quite figure out what it is. So would you take us briefly through both at NSA and at CIA, what you could have done and what you didn't do? Because I think you're right. It would have landed differently. What would you do?
So in my NSA life, I probably would have begun to push the metadata story of a sort. You know, it would not be, hey, read all about it. I mean, but to push the metadata story of a sort out there more aggressively earlier than we did. It came as a shock, and frankly, I was shocked that people were shocked. All right? I mean, I really was. And so bad on me. All right? If you all were shocked and I was shocked at that, then obviously we hadn't done what I thought we had done in kind of prepping the space for what it was we were doing. On renditions, detentions, interrogations, I actually think we did what we should have done. In 2006, we actually made an awful lot of this public, and public with a big P and public with a small p. Public, we had the president make a speech, and we went public with a small p with all of the members of the oversight committee rather than the gang of 8. All right? It was probably a little late. It was 2006. The president was politically weakened. Within 8 weeks of his going public with the program, his party lost control of both chambers of Congress. And a whole bunch of people thought they were going to run for president, which is not a good time to say, let's have a serious discussion. All right? And so I think we did the right thing there, but I think it was a bit late. Thank you. In terms of targeted killings, we have vacated the battlefield for explaining that these things have been done consistent with the laws of armed conflict, which demand necessity, distinction, and proportionality. And we have left others define the effects of these attacks by a reluctance to go out in more detail and say, let me tell you what we did. And by the way, Lisa Monaco made that speech 2 or 3 weeks ago. The administration was actually going to be more forthcoming, at least on a macro level, as to what it was we thought we did in 09, 10, 11, and 12. Not 08, which is interesting, but I think appropriate. An administration doesn't get extra credit for being transparent about their predecessors. All right? Okay. And so I think it's appropriate that they're going to do 09 and forward, but we haven't done it yet. And so those are concrete things, John, I think that we had, should have, or should do.
Yes, in the corner here. Again, name, affiliation, and please keep the microphone close to your mouth. We have folks listening online.
Hi, my name is Alex Paul. I work at the Atlantic Council. I wanted to ask, I saw commentary in the British press last week about post-Brussels, the need for a European-wide intelligence agency. I was just wondering if you can comment more on that, maybe some of the challenges and how that might be effectively responding to the threat.
This is something I could have put in the book, but it's a memoir of American intelligence, all right? So why would I do this? But it's not a new thought to me, all right? I think Europe is structurally malorganized to defend itself. Right? And hear me out, all right? What you've done at the Euro organs is you've put in those organs in Brussels, the European capital, not the Belgian capital. You've put in those organs in Brussels questions of commerce, trade, and privacy. The Europeans have kept questions of security at the national level. Right? That's a bad division of labor, because now you have the European institutions deciding questions of privacy as if privacy were the only issue one had to deal with. Now, we have ugly discussions over here in North America because we put the privacy mavens and the security mavens in the same room. And we have really ugly discussions, but at least we know we're talking about things we have to balance. I think, unfortunately, in the European structure, you've got the Euro institutions making decisions about privacy relatively insensitive to the impact of those decisions on security. And now you've got the national capitals having to live with the broad Euro rules when it comes to providing security. And so I guess I would say I don't have a lot of confidence in Euro institutions handling questions of espionage. I just don't. Even questions of joint analysis. And your description was right. Very often the connective tissue between European security institutions are American security institutions. And this is going to sound so hyperbolic that it's going to sound cartoonish, but there's a lot of truth in what I'm going to tell you. If a European service wants other Europeans to know, very often the best way of making that happen is to tell the Americans. Okay? Because it is, and again, this is overly cartoonish, and a lot of my European friends are going to be insulted because of my lack of nuance. But broadly, this is kind of a hub and spoke relationship with the Europeans, more than happy to share with the Americans, but don't see the real merits in sharing around the hub that way. Now, part of it is we're big, strong, powerful, and global. Everybody wants to be our friends. I mean, I just understand. It's not virtue on our part. We just got a lot of stuff, and so a lot of people want to come and share with us. All right, that's kind of how it's worked to date. I'm sorry to be so pessimistic, but I just don't think a Brussels organized effort is going to be very productive. I'm very confident it's not going to be very productive very soon. So.
Great. My deputy, Caleb Johnson, will offer a question from online.
Just a moment. Sorry, Tom. Okay. So how would you rate other countries' intel collection capabilities? Are there any who come close to the U.S. in terms of our... Don't know if you can answer that.
But based on European press coverage, apparently not. Okay, no one comes close to the Americans. David Ignatius had a wonderful turn of phrase right after Brussels. David said the European services are lining up in front of the American intelligence leviathan, okay, wanting American intelligence product, while their governments are still wringing their hands about American intelligence collection. I'm sorry, I had to let it out, all right? Okay. So in terms of, you want me to rack and stack? The French are good, all right? They're very aggressive. They got a lot of legal headroom, in fact, more headroom, legal headroom than the Americans do. The British are obviously very good. The Scandinavians punch way above their weight class. All right, they're small but very effective. We have a phrase, I used it on Morning Joe day before yesterday. We got a lot of time for those guys. What's the phrase we had at Langley for the Scandinavian services? The Germans have put some effort into this, but I would simply share they kind of bear a burden of history in terms of what it is their population and their government will allow them to do, even when everyone knows it's appropriate. It's that burden of history. The rest I would just describe as uneven, all right, in terms of what they bring to the fight. So again, I mean, y'all put a lot of money on us. All right? It's $50 billion a year and 100,000 people. You should expect something out of such an enterprise. I tell the story in the book. I had $2 in 2006 for every $1 George Tenet had on September 10th. Wow. Right? That's a lot of resources.
Yeah. Wow. Harlan Ullman.
I'm Harlan Ullman. General, good to see you again, and thanks
Good,
for your
Harlan.
comments.
Thanks.
I have a broader question that is not meant to be a critique of intelligence, but it gets to the issue of the integrity of knowledge and information that the President and leaders of Congress receive. I go back to days in Vietnam where we were not well served, and more recently, I have unfortunately firsthand experience in Pakistan, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other lovely places where I know the President and members of Congress were not getting good information for a number of reasons, which were largely bad, largely political. I don't know that there's any particular cure, but in retrospect, how do we try and get appropriate and accurate information to the President and members of Congress that is no longer politicized or less politicized? Because it seems to me the situation is not getting better and it's liable to get a lot worse in the future.
I don't know if I totally agree with the premise, but I totally agree with the challenge, all right, and the problem. There's an extended story in the book that actually comes, and let me talk a little bit about it because it serves as a good representation, and then I'll mention a few other things I know are important to you. What do you call that mess in Iraq? All right, I tell the story. I'm there August 06. I'm in the chair 90 days, less than that. I have two young analysts come in with what we call a serial flyer, which is a longer intel piece. And it was, what you got here in Iraq, Hayden, is a civil war. And I go, oh, civil war, interesting words, because they are incredibly politically charged. And I said, wow, what's your definition of civil war? I mean, I started asking legitimate questions, knowing full well the danger you just described. You do not want these kids writing stories about, well, Hayden wouldn't let me say what I believed. All right? But number one, it's wrong, and number two, there's no explaining that. All right? So I said, I'll tell you what, let's go to Iraq. That was already scheduled. So the two analysts came, two young women, and we go to Baghdad. We make the rounds. I mean, I get them in with Maliki, no, not Maliki. I get them in with Talabani. We go to stations and bases. We're in the green zone. I'm in the palace we use as our base, our station there. And I actually literally said, what the hell is going on here? And I had the whole station there. And we had a long discussion. So I leave them behind. I go to Islamabad and Kabul. I come back, and about a week or two later, I turn to my chief of staff. Whatever happened to those ladies we left in Baghdad? And where's their paper? And the response was, oh, you still want it? Yeah, I still want it. Right? And then I weave the story. I'll fast forward. I weave the stories. What do you call this conflict? I mean, it kind of went from dead enders to an insurgency to a civil war to where we finally ended up in January in an official NIE. with my guys pushing me very hard for the Civil War story. By the way, State Department pushed back against Civil War. CENTCOM pushed back against Civil War. The forces in Iraq pushed back against the Civil War. Finally, what ended up in the NIE was Civil War plus. Okay? In other words, Civil War is inadequate to describe how bad this situation is. But we got Civil War. I'm sorry, I'm going too much into detail, but I want to reflect that we actually take this seriously. I actually turned to my analysts and said, why is this such a big deal to you? And I think I knew the answer, but I wanted to press them. I mean, just tell the man what's going on. Why do you have to put a label on it? And they had a great answer. They said, if the man thinks, the president, thinks this is an insurgency, it is wise policy in an insurgency to arm the police. If this is a civil war, arming the police is arming one predatory element in what is truly a civil war rather than...
That's great.
Yeah, that's a good answer. So we did agonize over our analytic integrity and responsibility. So there's an example that I used to explain this dilemma. Other ones we just got wrong. The Iraq weapons of mass destruction, I'd say in the book, that's us. We did it, and it explains why. Another one that remains intensely political is the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate over the Iranian weapons program. And I tell the story there, all right? And I do not believe we were political. I believe we had an intensely political impact by the estimate, but it wasn't generated the other way around. And so it's a struggle, and now we fast forward, and what did or did not happen in Tampa with CENTCOM analysts, and I await the answer for that.
Fantastic. Great anecdote there, too. NIE, National Intelligence Estimate.
I'm sorry.
No, that's
I'm sorry.
right. Let me go to my CSIS colleague, Beverly Kirk.
Thank you, Tom. General Hayden, I have a question about the FBI and the Apple encryption and the news lately that the FBI has been kind of outside the bounds to work into the phone of the San Bernardino shooter. Is that the right way to do it rather than going to the courts, go to a private cybersecurity company that has been hacked?
So, as I say in the book, this is hard. And again, the texture of the book is this is an infinite field of gray. There's no purely white high ground, and there is no purely black marshland down here. And if you do A, because A is the best, you know you're paying a price in B, C, D, E, and F, and you're going to eventually pay that price. And that's really what it is I try to explain. So on the Apple case, and you all familiar? Okay, good. Yeah. I shade Apple. All right, which is kind of surprising for a former director of NSA, but I'm not the only one. Mike McConnell shades Apple, and so does Mike Chertoff. All right, and you can argue the Apple case on constitutional grounds. What do I know? I mean, I'm a fairly educated citizen, but I'm not a constitutional lawyer. Frankly, I think the government has the authority to direct Apple to open the phone. All right, but that's not my lane. You could argue it on privacy grounds. No, you can't. He's dead. He has no expectation of privacy, and it wasn't his phone. All right. I argue it on security grounds. And on security grounds alone, that lens, I believe on balance, America is better served if no one has punched a hole in an encryption system that we all rely on. All right, now I understand there's a hell of a price to pay over here in counterterrorism and just counter criminal activity. But you know, Jim Clapper, the last 3 rounds for the worldwide threat briefing, has said the biggest threat facing America is the cyber threat. And so they think twice here now before you actually impact what apparently was pretty good encryption in order to make you have a better winning hand over here in the terrorism and in the criminal lane. So that was my overall belief. Now, apparently, we've had this deus ex machina moment in this Greek tragedy. And in the last act, someone offshore has kind of come down from the upper reaches of the stage and solved our problem. All right? I don't think they have. I think all we've done is hit the pause button. We're still at the same point in the show. And let me describe for you what just happened in only slightly different ways, but ways I do not think are inaccurate. The United States government has just incentivized the private sector to create the equivalent of a zero-day attack to degrade generally available and generally used encryption. Ouch. Recall the privacy panel that President Obama launched after the Snowden thing, Mike Morrell, Richard Clark, Cass Sunstein, and so on. You go to that 370-page document and read it. And when you talk about vulnerabilities and 0 days and creating vulnerabilities, the rule they recommended was don't do that in generally used encryption products. And I could have this wrong. You know, I'm looking from the outside and it's all fast breaking, all right? I could have this wrong, but I think that's what we just did. All right, and so it's gotten us off the X, as they say at Langley, for the moment, but we're going to be back on the X very, very quickly. But again, thanks for the question, but that's not in the book, but it is the theme of the book. That this stuff, I was doing Maria Bartiromo on the book tour, all right, and I was in San Francisco, and I thought it was just going to be me and her, and I'm going to do the Apple thing. And late Saturday, it's a Sunday morning show. And late Saturday night, I discovered Ray Kelly is going to be on. Okay. No. And why? Yeah. And Ray and I are tight. There's actually a section of the book where I say the best liaison relationship we had, bar none, was CIA and NYPD. All right. So there's a fair amount of affection between me and the commissioner. But I figured, oh man, I know where he's going to be on this one. He wasn't. All right. He was where I was which was both sides in this issue better be careful about their prayers being answered. We need to take a pause here and look very carefully at what we're asking for. And this is one of the nation's top cops saying that. And I think it reflects the tone and texture of the book. These are very difficult questions. We need adult discussions. Sorry, long answer, but it plays to a whole bunch of things.
That's great. Trish Martinelli.
Thank you, sir. Trish Martinelli from the Office of Naval Intelligence Plans and Policy for Maritime Domain Awareness. So I think that you have a really unique perspective on the intelligence community over the last dozen or so years, being at the NSA, doing the restructure there, being at the CIA, and also being both pre and post establishment of the ODNI. So, did it work? Is our intelligence community more effective now and more cross-cutting than it has been? And then the second part of that question is, what do you see on the intelligence community horizon as the most complex policy issue that we'll face in the next 4 years?
Okay. So there's a chapter on the ODNI as a bridge between my NSA and CIA days. And I think the chapter is entitled, Is This Really Necessary? Okay. And I go through it. And I was a little... It's long, and I really took an axe to it to try to make it streamlined and sensible to the kind of people who are going to read the book. And I was surprised when the publisher, Penguin, and my editor, Scott Moyer, said, I like that chapter. And okay. I mean, it just kind of showed how things work here. And it's bureaucratic, but it showed how things work. So a couple of points I pulled from the chapter. Neither Jim Clapper and I thought this was a good idea. All right? That said, once it was clear this was going to happen, we jumped way over to the other side and said, we're going to do this. We're going to put a lot of bricks in this guy's rucksack. All right? And I explained why and so on. The Congress did not. All right? And so you've got a flawed structure in which responsibility is not commensurate with authority. All right? I don't know of anyone who's recommending we go back and do it again. The end of the chapter pretty much says, this will work. Right? Don't go changing the plumbing again on us. And it'll work if you do meet 3 conditions. Number 1, you pick the right person to be DNI. And the attribute the DNI needs is savvy, not brilliant, okay? Savvy. All right, so that's one. Number 2, the relationship between the president and the DNI has got to be like this, because the DNI does not derive its power from the law. I already said that. It derives his authority from his relationship with the president. Denny Blair, for example, brilliant guy, actually I compliment Denny in the book for some of the things he tried to do. Never was like this with the president, and you saw where that led. The other thing you need is a very good relationship between the DNI and the DCIA, because that C still means what it used to mean. All right, it is the most important of the others. All right, and it's got to have, the way I describe it is, the DNI owes the DCIA running room, and the other way, he owes them transparency. So if you get those three right, it's fine. It will make it work. The two unarguably good things to come out of the reform is NCTC, which could not have been constructed under a DCI. This nation could not digest a center where we merge the domestic and the foreign under the guy who is also the head of our foreign espionage service. Would not have worked. The other thing is I got to be the DCIA 24 hours a day. I was the first person in that suite who was not the DCI. Porter had been for a while. I don't know how those other guys did it. Right? I really thought being DCIA was more than 24 hours a day. And it does free the head of CIA to be the head of CIA. And that is an unintended consequence, but a very powerful one of the statute.
Go to one final question. Caleb, what's happening on Twitter?
All right, we've got an easy question for you, General. I'm kidding. We have a ninth grade world history professor who's writing in and asking whether Pakistan is really an ally in intelligence or in general, and where's that relationship going? So,
Okay, is Pakistan an ally, and where's the relationship going?
yeah.
It is an ally. And as I say in the book, it's the ally from hell. I say it in the book. I can't deny it. And I try to explain why the Pakistani worldview is not consistent with the American worldview. I'm sorry, I can flip that, okay? The American worldview is not consistent with the Pakistani worldview. I tell the story in the book that Pakistan, huh? What constitutes a Pakistani? Okay? I mean, what constitutes an American is an ideology, right? A German, more or less blood. Each nation has kind of its own creation mythology that then defines what that nation is. And again, Americans, it's mostly, you sign the document, you believe in it, you're in. Other countries depend more on family history and blood. So this is all in the book. I say, so what makes it Pakistani? Number one, it's not India. And number two, Islam. All right? Now, every time I flew to Pakistan to talk to Ashfaq Kayani or Ahmed Shuja Pasha, the head of ISI, it really didn't matter what it was I was talking to him about. I mean, I was always trying to get him to go do something, right? It didn't matter what the something was. The premise of my conversation was, you guys really need to stop fixating on the Indians. That's not the issue here. It's cutting against the foundation. I use the word mythology in a complimentary way. I mean, we all have foundation mythologies in our nations. It cuts against the foundation mythology that way. And then I said, now that you're done fixating on the Indians, let's you and I talk about making war on this particularly really bad slice of Islam, which is now cutting against the other foundation of Pakistani identity. I mean, that's hard work. Mm-hmm. And so because we have these countervailing visions of what this is really all about, the times we get agreement are by and large exceptions because we're coming from different places. Now that's probably too harsh. I don't think it's oversimplified. I actually think it's stark, but not oversimplified. I mentioned freely in the book, we have captured more al-Qaeda senior leadership with the assistance of Pakistan's ISI than with any other intelligence service on earth. But it doesn't counteract the fundamental issues we have. That right now, the vision we have and the vision that most Pakistanis have, they're actually inconsistent at the strategic level. We look at Afghanistan as an issue. They look upon Afghanistan as their strategic rear area, dealing with their main enemy, which is to their east. I mean, it just goes this way. And by the way, they have got to maintain influence in their strategic rear. I mean, once you accept the premises, everything that happens is very logical. They have to maintain, well, how should you maintain influence? Well, we got these people called Pashtuns that straddle that artificial line the British drew on the map called the Durand line, right? And so we maintain influence in our strategic rear by maintaining very good relationships with the Pashtun nation, which straddles the line. And we call the Pashtuns they rely on to establish their strategic rear. We have a word for them. We call them Taliban. For them, they're Pashtuns who helped establish a strategic rear area. I mentioned in the book that if Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was flying commercial all the times he went to Pakistan, he'd never have to pay for an airline ticket again in his life. He'd have so many frequent flyer miles, all right? I mean, he really tried to establish a relationship with General Kayani, who is now Chief of Army Staff. He's kind of gotten beyond ISI. And the Admiral, in his last testimony in front of Congress, blames the ISI for funding the Haqqani network for attacking the American embassy in Kabul. It's a very difficult relationship.
Indeed. Well, great point.
Get one more. Come on, a happy question.
Oh,
Well,
good.
we can't end on
Excellent.
something
Happy
so
to-
stark.
Let's get one more from the field here. Yes.
It's a happy one, right?
Please. Let's wait for the microphone so folks online can hear it. We have a microphone coming down from Maria. Kathleen? No, they need to hear it online. Thank you.
Good evening, General. Brigadier retired Peter Zwack, former defense attaché, Moscow, NDU. Could we talk a little bit, could you speak a little bit about your perspectives in regard to Russia, Russia and counterterror? Obviously an extremely difficult relationship, but are there also any possibilities, prospects of being able to better cooperate?
Should have stuck with the Pakistanis.
Let's backpedal.
So, something that's very revealing. There's nothing about Russia in this book. Okay? My wife Ginny's here in the front row. We went to more than 50 countries, stations and bases, when I was director. Not one of them was Russia. That absence should scream at you. And by the way, I'm not saying that because I'm proud of it. It's probably a mistake. Not because they were very useful. They were not. All right? And in terms of counterterrorism, one of our big issues was anybody they didn't like, they told us was a terrorist. Mm-hmm. And that also creates tension. Now, there's a legal and moral responsibility to warn, and we did all that. But we didn't see an awful lot of convergence with the Russian Federation. Probably my bad. All right? Not because there was convergence, but because, as you well know, very often when states don't have good relationships, the only ties that bind are the intelligence relationships. And I should have left Leon, and Leon should have left John, or David and John, a larger Rolodex with Russian names, with who've been hosted and with whom we had established relationships. So the fact that it's not mentioned in the book should tell you something. And it's something I look back on and say, yeah, should have paid more attention to those guys. Now I was consumed with a bunch of other things. It's understandable, if not excusable. All right? But I should have done more. Very briefly on Russia today, I said on Morning Joe about a year ago that Putin's doing everything he's doing, which is making us uncomfortable, and the man doesn't have more than a pair of sevens in his hand. He's got no picture cards, and he knows it, and he knows he's not going to draw any because of all the things that are happening to Russia and with regard to population and oil and gas and entrepreneurship and democracy and so on, which actually I think makes him more rather than less dangerous. I think it makes him more willing to risk things in the near term because he knows time is not his friend over the long term. And so, again, not in the book. My personal preference would have been a stronger pushback, probably not for Crimea. I understand history, all right, but certainly for the Donbass and what's going on there. And you know what? I'm not so sure we've made him certain that we'd stand in Latvia. And I do think we really do need to go do that.
Let me tag a small question on the end of that. One of the projects we're doing now is on foreign fighters. The DNI, General Clapper, stated in his testimony in just a few weeks ago that there are now 38,500 fighters who have come to the battle space, Syria, Iraq, and Libya since the beginning of the Syrian civil war. Hundreds, if not thousands, of those have come from the Caucasus and other parts of Russia. Do you see now an opportunity to work with the Russians on the foreign fighter issue in particular?
There are opportunities where there is convergence. It is tactical convergence. It is not strategic convergence. You can't end Syria with the Alawites under Assad in charge. You've got a permanent insurrection by 60% of the population. And the Russian objective at the strategic level is to sustain one form or another of that government. And you just don't get out of this bubble unless you create that change. So even though, you get them to bomb ISIS, that's good, all right? At the ultimate strategic level, our interests do not converge.
Excellent. Good note to end on. Before I thank General Hayden, let me first thank my team, Transnational Threats, and our advisors who are here today very much for all your contributions to making this a success. My name is Tom Sanderson, Director of Transnational Threats. Very happy to host you, General Hayden. You did a tremendous service to our country officially, and you continue to do so with the work that you do and also with your book. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, fantastic. Fantastic.